everyone. My name is Lauren Davis, and I'm here with my colleague, Sanjay Jolly. We're both second-year students here at Penn Law, and both recipients of the Toll Public Interest Program. We have the pleasure of introducing tonight's event. This dialogue is the second in a series of lectures on media and the First Amendment, sponsored by Stephanie Abruzin, Penn Law class of 1991. The series addresses the impact of the First Amendment on documentaries and modern media. We thank Stephanie Abruzin for her support and involvement in making this lecture series a success. The Penn program on documentaries and the law also wishes to thank Anna Gavin of Program Support, Vincent De Jesus and Neil Swisher of Penn Law ITS, Yoka Takahashi of Communications, and Senior Lecturer Adam Brody of the Docs program for their assistance in producing this event. The topic of this evening's dialogue is demagoguery, not demagogues. Demagogues do not have a monopoly on demagoguery. We will be concerned with what demagoguery is, the conditions that nurture it, and the path that leads a society away from outcome-based discourse, serving the interests of a frightened insider group to broad-based democratic deliberation that is grounded in facts and policy choices. Although the Penn program on documentaries and the law is sponsoring this evening's dialogue, little will be said about the host of American documentaries that deal with demagoguery and mostly charismatic demagogues. The handout that you have been provided contains information about some of these films, compiled by reference librarian Merrill Slyhoff of the Biddle Law Library. Consider how well these films match up with this evening's dialogue about demagoguery as a form of rhetoric and political practice.
Now let me introduce our discussants. Professor Patricia Roberts-Miller is the Professor of Rhetoric and Writing and Director of the University Writing Center at the University of Texas at Austin. She obtained her BA, MA, and PhD in Rhetoric from the University of California at Berkeley. Before moving to UT in 2004, Professor Roberts-Miller taught at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and the University of Missouri-Columbia. She is the author of 5 books: Rhetoric and Demagoguery, Demagoguery and Democracy, Fanatical Schemes, Pro-Slavery Rhetoric and the Tragedy of Consensus, Deliberative Conflict, Argument, Political Theory, and Composition Classes, and Voices in the Wilderness, Public Discourse and the Paradox of the Puritan Rhetoric, as well as numerous book chapters, articles, reviews, and blog posts. Professor Roberts-Miller's book, Demagoguery and Democracy, is the 2019-2020 first-year book for the University of Maryland College Park campus. Seth Kreimer is the Kenneth W. Gemmill Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, where he was a member of the Law Journal. He joined the Penn Law faculty in 1981 after clerking for the Honorable Arlen M. Adams of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and practicing law with the Philadelphia firm of Fine, Kaplan, and Black. He is a longtime board member, cooperating attorney, and chair of the Legal Committee of the Philadelphia chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. In addition to authoring dozens of scholarly articles and essays, Professor Kreimer has served as co-counsel, or amici, in nearly the same number of civil rights and civil liberties cases, many of them involving First Amendment issues. He has also been a consultant on various constitutional law and litigation matters for a broad range of social justice organizations in the Philadelphia area.
My area of expertise is what I've taken to calling train wrecks in public deliberation. So I'm interested in times that communities came to very bad decisions, ones that they later regretted, but they used a lot of rhetoric to get there. And so these are things like, the Sicilian expedition that is in 5th century BCE, or Johnson's decision to escalate Vietnam in 1965, the Iraq invasion, all sorts of things. And what kind of surprised me, I initially started doing those simply because people in my field in rhetoric tend to look at times that rhetoric was wonderful. And being somewhat of an oppositional personality, I decided that I wanted to look at times that it wasn't. So I was surprised to notice that they had an awful lot of things in common. And it was not necessarily that there were individuals who were the same or even policies that were the same, but how people thought about rhetoric, about public deliberation was extremely similar. And I ended up calling that demagoguery. which may or may not have been a good choice of words. So my basic premise is that all political issues are inherently policy issues. They are what Aristotle would call deliberative rhetoric. We have to make a decision about what we will or will not do. And in these cultures of demagoguery, that rich and nuanced world of policy options was and is denied in favor of framing our cultural problem as a question of us versus them. It's a kind of zero-sum battle in which any gain on their part is a loss on our part and vice versa. And those two sides, so now we just talk about liberal versus conservative, and it may seem that these two sides are opposed, but they actually agree on an awful lot about disagreement. Unfortunately, one of the things on which there seems to be a tremendous amount of agreement is that there is no legitimate disagreement with their position. They agree that politics is a zero-sum battle between us and them. They just disagree as to who is who. They agree that for every problem there is one solution, and that disagreement is the consequence of the presence of people with bad motives. This agreement that disagreement is useless can come from several different positions. So I don't mean to say that the left and right are actually equally prone to this, but that you can find people making this kind of argument all over the political spectrum. I actually think we don't have a left versus right. I think the sort of spectrum model is much more useful. This agreement that disagreement is useless can come from several different positions, but two are important in our era: political narcissism and political sociopathy. For some people, there's only one legitimate understanding of the common good, mine. And everyone who disagrees is blinded by self-interest, duped by the media, or knowingly advocating a bad policy. To say that there's only one political good and that I, and only I, am the one oriented toward that good on every kind of issue is a sort of political narcissism. Another position is that there's no legitimate political disagreement because none of us is really interested in the common good. There is no common good at all. We are all out for ourselves, and no position is ethically superior to another. There are just winners and losers, and any political or rhetorical strategy is allowed if it's oriented toward winning. And that's what I think is usefully characterized as a sort of political sociopathy. Now, those aren't all the positions possible, obviously, but there are two that I hear a lot when people are arguing for a no-holds-barred wrestling match between us and them. I think the people who advocate those positions are sincere. I think that people who argue that they and only they are advocating the one political good in every situation believe that that is true. They cannot imagine any other position might have any legitimacy in any circumstance. They believe that everyone sees the world exactly as they do. And those who believe that everyone is out for their own good really are out for their own good. And they think everyone else is too. So what neither of those two realize is that not everyone is like them. They universalize from their own position, posture, and ideology. I think we disagree about politics because we really disagree. People who privilege disagreement, who see disagreement as an important step toward the best agreements, do so for all sorts of different reasons and from all sorts of different positions, such as various forms of relativism, perspectivism, fallibilism, and various other epistemologies and political agenda. But I want to set all that aside in order to talk about what happens in a culture in which all disagreements are framed as a zero-sum battle between us and them. And spoiler alert, it is not pretty. The culture of demagoguery often begins as a cunning rhetorical framing of political disagreements as a zero-sum battle between two groups because that frame is more mobilizing and motivating for voters, donors, and consumers of media. But it can easily become what people believe is an accurate description of our political landscape and our policy options. So, for instance, I'll mention one example, which is that slave states first advocated secession as a solution to their political situation in 1828. It was clearly just a sort of, not exactly a scare tactic, but a way of demonstrating more loyalty than other people had. But after 20 years, that became, people started to think that was really an option and really good policy. Once you've created something as a position, as a posture of loyalty to the in-group, it becomes incredibly difficult culturally to back off of that. So initially, something like the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice is framed as a battle between us and them because that frame is more likely to get people to contact their representatives, donate to their party, and support their party's decision. It's also more likely to motivate people to read articles, subscribe, watch the news, click on links. This false binary of our political choices benefits political parties and a for-profit media. The zero-sum battle means that not only is disagreement delegitimated, but disagreement is demonized. compromise, bargaining, finding common ground. From within this false binary, those are ways of trucking with the devil, and I don't mean that in the Grateful Dead sense. One doesn't compromise with the devil after all, one exterminates him. So unless this rhetoric is stopped, unless the zero-sum us versus them frame for politics results in a rhetoric of extermination. And I hope I didn't move too fast on that. And then the train wrecks. So once disagreement is demonized and political disagreements are framed as a battle between good and evil, the appointment of a Supreme Court justice can easily be described as simply one battle in a war of political extermination and existential threat. As soon as one side makes claims of wanting to exterminate the other, then both sides can frame the political situation as one of existential threat. And once we are in a situation of existential threats, then we are justified in anything we do. We are in Giorgio Agamben's state of exception, in which we honor the law by suspending or abrogating it. The narrative that enables the suspension of law is that the one group that genuinely honors the law is forced into a situation in which law must be suspended or violated due to the evil machinations of the other side. And that is the plot of about 80% of Law and Order episodes, which is too bad because I kind of like that show. Now, it would seem that once a political party has used the rhetoric of existential threat to get into power, that rhetoric would lose its force. After all, they're now in power. How can they claim that they are their existence is threatened when they're the ones, getting people thrown in jail or losing their jobs? But the rhetorical challenge becomes, once you are in power, how do you maintain the rhetoric of threat and victimization, which is so much a part of McCarthy's rhetoric, that enabled you to gain power? Paradoxically, the acquisition of power enables this supposedly victimized group to use its propaganda machine, as well as the forces of government, to justify the removal of all checks and balances on the in-group, executive specifically, on the in-group generally, but especially on the in-group executive, and to instate a single-party government by declaring the executive above judicial restraint, exempt from charges of criminal behavior, allowed to use their position not only to protect themselves from accountability, but to profit financially, even obscenely, to use the financial resources of the government to reward loyal political allies, and to use all the financial, investigative, prosecutorial, and coercive resources of the government to exterminate powerful sites of dissent. Once the procedural constraints have been defanged, and the neutrality of any institution is falsely politicized as part of a hostile outgroup conspiracy, so any criticism must mean you're part of the communists. Even a neutral organization, the fact that there is no sense of such a thing as a neutral organization. You're on our side or you're on theirs. And it's done so through part of being a hostile conspiracy, such as being part of a communist front. Once an executive has made it clear that he refuses to be restrained or held accountable, that he is personally profiting and openly trying to institute a one-party government, of which he is the head, then it becomes possible to factionalize all parts of the government, especially traditionally neutral parts, such as the military and police forces. At this point, even members of his own party and his own base should recognize the danger and work to check the overreach of power. And if they do, as happened with FDR and the attempted packing of the Supreme Court, we step back from the brink. But as both How Democracies Die and Why Nations Fail, and I think those are two interesting examples because they're from very different places on a political spectrum, as they both describe the very people who could stop the overreach, that is, in-group political figures and media, the judiciary, the military, or the base often don't. The people who could stop the overreach often choose not to. If the executive is doing whatever is necessary to keep the economy benefiting his base, keep his base from listening to criticism of him, continuing to promote that through his loyal propaganda machine, which is an important part of this, the narrative that all of their problems are caused by them, and that is the party that he's eliminating. If his propaganda machine can persuade his base of that, then they will believe that they are flying when really he's just persuaded them to jump out of a window with him. Now, I'm talking about in the abstract, but I think that everyone in this room knows that I'm actually talking about a very specific political figure and a specific political era, and it's Hitler. And specifically what he did between March 1933 and March 1939, but I think you could put it even earlier and say more like March 1937. So in 4 years, what he managed to do in Germany. Now, there are a lot of other cases, someone rising to power on the waves created by the culture of demagoguery, Ceausescu, Stalin, Mugabe, Chavez, and others. Sometimes the structures of checks and balances were weak, sometimes they were strong, and people chose not to enforce them. But in all cases, there was a culture of demagoguery. Thank you.
Unlike Trish, I'm a simple country law professor. And I teach constitutional law, and I teach about the kind of long waves of constitutional law. And a lot of discussion in my field these days revolves around originalism. How many people have heard the phrase originalism? Okay, how many people are lawyers out there? Okay, you got your CLA, right? So I believe that historical context is only one element from which constitutional structure is forged, but it's an important one. So I want to begin my discussion by sharing a story of original demagoguery. The story begins in the election of 1796, a bitterly fought election, the first contested election in American presidential history, between the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists with Adams at the head. Adams wins 71 electoral votes to 68 electoral votes, and Jefferson becomes vice president. Not the most auspicious of partnerships. Over the next few years, cleavages over policies regarding nationalism and localism, alignment with the British, support for the French, war and peace, combined with personal animosity and ambition to devolve into partisan trench warfare. Now, if we think that today's level of public vituperation is unprecedented, we should think again. Okay? So here's a sampling of the rhetoric on both sides. Adams is described by the Jeffersonians as old, bald, querulous, crippled, blind, toothless Adams, and it goes on from there. Jefferson is described with accusations that he would cast the Bible into a bonfire, turn our holy worship into a dance of Jacobin frenzy, our wives and daughters dishonored, and our sons converted into disciples of Voltaire and dragoons of Marat. This is hardcore, I think what Trish would refer to as demagoguery. The problem, as Adams and the Federalists saw it, was that these confrontations carried the twin risks of continuing a cascade of malicious falsehoods that would either provoke violent instability of the sort that the country had experienced during the Whiskey Rebellion only 3 years earlier. I mean, we really had a rebellion in western Pennsylvania where they had to march in the nationalized militia to put it down. Or deliver the country into the hands of Napoleon, a foreign autocrat who was attacking the sovereignty of Europe's states and had turned his eyes on the New World. What to do? Well, John Marshall, then a part of the Adams administration, later, of course, Chief Justice Marshall of the Supreme Court, viewed this as an existential threat. And in words that I think echo today, he says it's vain to urge that truth will prevail. The experience of the world and our experience prove that a continued course of defamation will at length sully the fairest reputation. And, he says, even though it may not poison the minds of the majority of citizens, it will affect a considerable number, and enough will be infected that disaster will occur. What to do? The Federalist administration successfully persuaded Congress to pass the Sedition Act of 1798, making it a federal crime, to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings with intent to defame the President, Congress, or the government. the statute went out of its way to go further than the common law to provide a defense of truth and to provide a limited time that it would be in effect. So what could be wrong? What could go wrong? Who is in favor of false, scandalous, and malicious writings? Well, predictably, right, what goes wrong is that federal prosecution is in the hands of the Adams administration. Jeffersonian partisans are prosecuted. Hostile judges and juries ignore claims of truth. And at the same time, Federalist vituperation runs free. Indeed, if you read that statute carefully, you have noticed one major omission. It is illegal to falsely, scandalously, and maliciously defame the president or Congress, but not the vice president, who, of course, is Jefferson. You will also notice, by the way, that it expires March 3rd, 1801, which is the last day of Adams' term. The reaction against this effort was part of the groundswell that swept Jefferson into office. The Federalists gained 61% of the vote, and Jefferson, upon election, pardoned the Sedition Act defendants and adopted an approach, or at least a rhetorical approach, that I think Trish would find appealing. And made the argument that the hallmark of American identity is the ability to think freely and speak and write what Americans think. And he went on to say, if there are those who would dissolve the Union or change its Republican form, acknowledging that there are potential problems on both sides, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. By the end of the term, Jefferson reiterates a series of arguments in favor of an openness. The idea that the goal is that Americans should be governed by reason and truth. We leave open the avenues to truth. The press is the most important avenue to truth. The press is important to remain open because those who fear investigation will shut it up. And he says, in order to keeping those doors open and to fortify the habit of testing everything by reason is the most effectual manacle we can rivet on the hands of our successors to prevent their manacling the people with their own consent. Good stuff. A good heritage. And in 1806, the Jefferson administration invokes not the Sedition Act, but an alleged the common law of seditious libel to go after the Hartford Courant, which had with Barzillai, Hudson, and George Goodwin at the helm, which had free rein under the Adams administration for publishing an allegation, which was false, that Jefferson had paid $2 million to bribe Napoleon and therefore had turned the country into a tax gatherer for an insatiable, savage, and bloody tyrant. Ultimately, he also went after a guy named Reverend Ezel Backus, who made the somewhat better grounded accusation that Jefferson's interactions with his slaves made him, quote, a liar, whoremaster, and debaucher. The prosecutions, as it turns out, ran aground not on the First Amendment, but on the conclusion that there was no authority for federal courts to adopt common law crimes. But the moral here, right, is that I think one moral here is that Everybody does it if it's available. The other moral is that the history of American legal identity has embodied a series of lessons from this. Right? First, that the Sedition Act, the notion that the government can prosecute people even for false criticism, has lost in the court of history. Justice Brennan writes in the New York Times against Sullivan, although it was never tested in this court, the attack on its validity has carried the day in the court of history. He cites Calhoun, he cites Jefferson, he cites the fact that Congress has repaid the fines that were levied. Okay, so one proposition is the Sedition Act has been judged unconstitutional in the court of history. Second, notwithstanding some lapses, the American system has come to adopt a set of norms of reciprocity that allow us to invoke our future anticipations as a way of explaining uncomfortable current toleration. We include vicious invective along with temperate reason on the theory that freedom must be accorded to the ideas we hate if it is going to be preserved for the ideas we cherish. That sort of reciprocity and vision of the future self is something that echoes through judicial decisions. Originally articulated by Holmes in the 20s, repeated by Alito in 2017. So that image is one that is part of the American background. In addition, we have the foundational propositions that Brandeis articulates in his concurrence in Whitney against California, that first of all, government suppression of speech is at odds not only with national ideals, but also is a power that's easily misused to prevent the investigation of wrongdoing and to menace freedom by rendering the people inert. Conversely, the claim is, the belief is, the aspiration is, that allowing contenders to join issue in the public sphere without official cushioning both betokens and generates the courage and responsibility to live well in a world of limits and uncertainty. The working hypothesis is that liberty of thought and opinion is valuable as an end and as a means. It's necessary to self-government. And in contrast to Marshall, free discussion ultimately provides protection against the triumph of demagoguery. Murrow is one example. The claims that Murrow made are claims about American identity, about American aspiration, and about the importance of reciprocal freedom as the future. Now, let's shift to the present, or close to the present. In her writing, Professor Roberts-Miller articulates a series of heuristics that incline public discussion towards fair-mindedness, inclusive deliberation, being willing to compromise, trying to argue well, and thinking things through. That incline discussion away from identity-based zero-sum discourse. Those are good and high aspirations, but as a simple constitutional lawyer, I want to focus on a more limited one. The aspiration that disputes should be joined on the basis of facts that inform deliberation about real needs and real solutions. And even narrower, on the question of whether providing more information can in fact generate facts for common deliberation. One argument is that of course it does. More information allows people to make better choices. And indeed, when they see true information, people will choose true information. Has anyone ever encountered the Ash experiment, the Ash conformity experiment? Nobody has. Okay, so here's the deal. Solomon Asch, writing in the 1950s, and this is something that I can't point to, but I will. Solomon Asch, writing in the early 1950s, does this social psychology experiment, and it's replicated regularly over time. The experiment is this. A series of individuals are put in a room with a series of Confederates who are coached to say that the obviously different line is the same. So a subject goes in, they see the lines, they're asked which is the same length, and their colleagues either say all A or all B. 75% agree with the majority at least once that it's not C when it's C, apparently. However, with one dissenter, as long as there's one person who is saying what is true, the compliance with the majority goes down to 5%. The question is, does that result survive in the wild in the modern era? In real life, it's often hard to discern how long the lines are. And we know that people are differentially attentive to information that confirms their inclinations. More importantly, we live in a world of superabundant information. Powerful, skilled, or bored online sources churn out a deluge of information. Some true, some partially true, some Frankfurterian bullshit, some consciously mendacious efforts to overwhelm critical facilities. The information pools in an apparently endless ocean of doubts and so-called evidence. It's possible to glean from this ocean the pieces of a mosaic that puncture or support almost any claim. And it's worse because we know that online interactions tend to cluster. So you hear more and more of what you agree with. In this context, the question is the Brandeis-Jefferson approach still warranted? An indication. I mean, given the Asch experiment, I had to put this one up. This is the questions after the recent inauguration. Which photo is from which inauguration? And among enthusiasts for the current president, 40% claimed that the photo from the prior inauguration was the photo for this inauguration. 15% actually said that the one on the left had more people in it. All right, so what do we do with this? My conclusion is that even in the modern world, facts and reasoned arguments still stand guard against the triumph of mean-spirited authoritarian thuggery. Partly because there are still virtuous participants in the public sphere, partly because there are institutions that are constructed to foster facts and reasoned argument. Career civil servants care about fact and reasoned argument. They act upon them, and they, not infrequently, reveal inconvenient truths. Judges care about facts and reasoned argument. Judge Amy Berman Jackson today commented, and you can see Amy Berman Jackson sitting right there. No, you could if I could point to her, but you can see her in the center of the photograph. Commented today, truth still exists, truth still matters, insistence that it doesn't, and pride and lies are a threat to the very foundation of our democracy. Judges are trained to care. They enter into dialogue in a situation that cares. There's a stock of elected public officials at state, local, and federal levels who care about facts and reasoned argument. Most news organizations and most reporters care about facts, and many participants in public debate and institutions of civil society. Privately owned, independent networks of communications, NGOs, advocates often have reason to act as counterweights to truth decay and authoritarian thuggery. And the public ultimately responds to a cascade of reasoned argument. Or at least that is, it seems to me, a plausible claim upon which to act, particularly because I remain convinced that legal mechanisms to suppress demagoguery are most likely to be deployed, as Jefferson warned and demonstrated in yielding to temptation, to manacle the people with their own consent.
The reason I'm interested in culture of demagoguery is demagogues don't create that culture, they're the consequence of it. And that culture exists because people choose to consume that kind of media. So I don't think it is something that the government can do a whole lot about, that it isn't already doing. You know, prosecuting people for inciting to riot, as in regard to the Charlottesville incidents. But otherwise, I think it's got to be the choices that we make. I will say I'm less hopeful than you in that Bankler et al.'s network propaganda shows that there is a difference in how different media respond to things like fact-checking, correcting, and that, you know, Fox News is very bad about it. So is Rachel Maddow, unfortunately. So yeah, I'm not sure at this point with how popular Fox News is. I think 49% of Americans think it's an unbiased source. So I'm not as hopeful about that.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I believe that every news medium will become virtuous. My tentative belief is that the ecosystem of sources of reason and truth will interact in ways that ultimately make room for reason and truth to be a substantial part of the public sphere. I mean, no one it's true. You may have demonization, you may have ongoing demonization, and you have the possibility of a continuing flow. The crucial question is what sorts of intermediate institutions stand up or continue to stand up or are legally supported standing up to be part of that ongoing network.
I think that the ecology has changed, though, in the way that outrage is much more profitable, and that's the argument that's made in the book, I think, called Outrage Industry, that because, as you say, there's so many sources available, that it's more fun to read a source that's going to be outrageous, make you feel great about hating the other. You know, it's a 2-minute hate, but it's 24/7. But I mean, what I would think is that only solution that we're going to find is if people choose to try to find the best outgroup sources, because they do exist. You can disagree vehemently with them, but at least they're more responsible about checking their facts, about having facts. But somehow we have to persuade people that it's worth the time, instead of looking at Fox News, to go to the Cato Institute or Heritage or National Review or Wall Street Journal.
Well, I guess the question is how might one persuade people to act differently?
Well, okay, so isn't it Dewey who talked about occupational psychosis, as that you always think that your profession is the one that's going to save things? So, I mean, I actually do think that is how we teach argument. I think that we don't do a very good job of it. I think we don't do a very good job in freshman comp of teaching people how to assess sources. The classic assignment is pick a topic, take a stand, find 4 sources. So, yeah, that's, you know. So I really do think that it's got to be more about teaching people, you know, how you assess a source that is not simply, does it have facts, and does it seem objective, because we always think that our point of view is objective.
Well, I mean, here's an interesting question. You earlier said that when one moves from arguments about utilitarian advantages and disadvantages to arguments about identity, that's a step on the road to perdition. I think that was what I understood you to say.
As long as if it's a zero sum, if it's identity and we're going to admit that there are multiple identities, that's a different situation. So
Well, I mean, here's a hypothesis what Murrow was deploying was actually in part an identity-based argument. And one thing that, as you say, everybody's hammer is the relevant one for the nail in question.
Right.
And what appeals to me about teaching constitutional law at its best is that it is a construction of an American identity that people can appeal to in times of crisis. And at its best, at its worst, the Supreme Court does terrible things, but at its best, even in protecting the Westboro Baptist Church or Animal Crush videos, the Supreme Court in the First Amendment era is making clear that there is a unique American identity that calls us to an aspiration towards tolerance and openness. So, I am inclined to think that teaching aspirations and national identity is another important way of calling people to move away from zero-sum in-group, out-group. If our identity is to encompass all of these groups.
Yeah, and since it bothers me, it must make you absolutely foaming at the mouth. But anytime the Supreme Court makes a decision that people don't like, it's fascinating to me to learn how many of my friends do not actually understand how the Supreme Court works and what its job is. And if the Supreme Court makes a decision that I don't like and they don't like, but it's fully in line with the precedents and case law and laws and everything, the number of people who think that they should have done something different is concerning. So I think there is also an absence of people understanding how the Constitution is supposed to work, who's supposed to do what, and the virtues of losing.
So here's a question on the virtues of losing and the Great American Seminar. What was your reaction in the terms that we've been talking about to the impeachment trial?
Well, I think that what Pelosi was doing was, I think that she was setting up a situation that she knew would happen, and that once the campaign starts, more and more information is going to come out that's going to make the Senate decision look very bad, and especially the Senate refusal to talk to witnesses. So I think that was a political decision on her part rather than a constitutional one.
Well, I mean, here.
Is that what you're asking?
No. I mean, I'll be even more confrontational, insofar as you and I are basically nice folks and are not confrontational. We've been looking for ways to teach the American polity about dialogue regarding public policy that takes into account possibilities of evidence on both sides. Mm-hmm. Wasn't what we saw a several-week-long enactment of exactly what both you and I aspire to have public policy discussions be? Sure, there was some snarling on both sides, mm-hmm. And of course there was no golden age. I have up there the discussion of old blind Paul, crippled Adams, and Jacobin, mm-hmm. Debauched Jefferson. But in some ways, having people stand up and give reasons for their opinions in ways that were not fundamentally, for the most part, appealing to in-group and out-group, but appealing to questions of evidence, was a dramatization of what we aspire to.
No.
All right.
I think that, well, let me put it this way, and I should probably preface it with, I spend a disproportionate amount of time crawling around the internet arguing with extremists. And so one of the questions I always pose to people, and this I think is the standard for a rational argument, I didn't invent this, a lot of people use this one, is under what conditions would you change your mind? And are there any conditions under which you would change your mind? And so it was very clear, since people were making arguments, that were contradicted by what they'd said a week before, a month later, when Clinton was getting impeached, that these were not arguments from principle and that these were not rational arguments in that sense.
And there was Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
So the question is...
And Susan Collins saying that Trump learned.
Yeah.
So,
which, in terms of reasoned dialogue, is entirely within the sphere. You may not believe her.
All right, I understand what you're saying. Yeah. So what's fascinating to me about when I started working on demagoguery is the number of people who can put forward a totally demagogic argument that is civil, has data, and has reasons. So that shouldn't be our aspiration. So you can get somebody like Earl Warren that I talk about in the book who has charts and maps and all this data that is not logically related to his claims. And that's how demagoguery can work, is that you have reasons, but they're not related to the claims, and also you aren't consistently holding to them. So that's a sense in which I think sometimes I get read as saying that we shouldn't discuss identity at all as for some sort of Habermasian ideal public sphere or Rawlsian, original condition, and that's original situation. And that's not what I mean. But it's just that should be all that we talk about. But I think it is relevant to say, here is somebody who has made these arguments under these conditions, and so that's not good faith argument, if they are clearly contradicting things that they've said elsewhere. So that's a sort of different distinction that's really important in my field, is good faith versus bad faith argumentation. So yeah, people were making arguments, but it was bad faith argumentation.
Where do we stand on questions? We are ending at 7:30. Is that correct? So.
They're trying to read my handwriting.
So, all right. So, does demagoguery increase engagement? Is it beneficial to combat apathy? And therefore, perhaps it should be embraced.
When I first started working on demagoguery, I assumed that, I'm not sure it's always bad, which is why I think what matters is whether there's a culture of demagoguery. If it's our default, it's how we argue about everything. That's really the problem. But yeah, it definitely mobilizes people. It's one of the ways that people will raise money for an organization, right? Is split an organization into two groups and see what side can make the most donations. So I don't think it's inherently bad. It depends on who's making the argument, who's the outgroup. If it's an outgroup that is institutionally or systemically, oppressed, it's going to be different, and how widespread demagoguery is. I mean, right now we've got demagoguery about like Justin Bieber and Nickelback.
Well, it's interesting because as I read your account of the perils of identity-based and dichotomous thinking, it occurred to me that a lot of social justice organizations engage in precisely that. If I think about the civil rights movement, it's true that Dr. King talked about the beloved community, which is entirely encompassing, but lots of other members of the movement, not to mention the folk songs, were much more dichotomous. Or if you go back to the labor movement, right? Which side are you on? In Harlan County, you're either a thug for J.H. Blair or a member of the forces of light with the Union. And that's kind of, and in some ways, the question, how do you go about dealing with what seems to be an important element of mobilization to achieve to achieve social goals?
Well, okay, so demagoguery it's highly fallacious. There's a lot of projection involved. I think you can still engage in we have these groups and they're damaging and they're hurting us and they're engaged in bad policies. That is not necessarily demagogic. I think Malcolm
Thugs
X.
for J.H. Blair?
I don't know. Well, see, I don't know those cases. So all
Oh, you don't even know this folk song.
No,
You're not as old as I am.
I just don't like folk songs. But I would say, so a lot of times people want to talk about somebody like Malcolm X, right? But Malcolm X, even the Ballad of the Bullet, he's got his enemies, the crackers Congress, but there were crackers in Congress. They were a problem. Being vehement in criticism and maybe even in some cases, he's not unfair as it turns out. But I just don't think that's really what.
So we got another prompt?
Yeah. So is demagoguery not inevitable and necessary depending on the context? Take, for example, demagoguery against fascists during denazification in the post-war era. Abstracted from real political stakes, is it necessary for demagoguery to always take on a negative valence? Surely demagoguery against oligarchs is qualitatively differently than against immigrants. Yeah. I'm not sure about the demagoguery in denazification because, again, they were Nazis. They really did it. So there was a projection and there wasn't false accusations. There wasn't scapegoating. I do think that that's when you're talking about how harmful demagoguery is, there's that question of, is it reinforcing existing structures of oppression? And that's why, demagoguery about Justin Bieber is weird, but it's not harmful. I suppose demagoguery about Nickelback may have hurt their profits some, but not by much. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, the way that you feel about Harlan County, I feel about Nickelback. It's above my pay grade. So, if bad faith reasoning constitutes demagoguery, can there be an objective definition of the term?
Bad faith argumentation is actually a bigger category, and then demagoguery would be a kind of bad faith. In the same way that you've got propaganda, and then demagoguery is a kind of propaganda, it would be sort of similar. But I think that the way, and this is maybe I've read too much Habermas, but it's also Aristotle's argument, Plato's argument, that if you can imagine the conditions under which you would change your mind, if you're open to persuasion, that's a different kind of discussion from one in which you aren't. And that's a requirement for good faith argumentation. It also has common sense things like you're willing to stand by what you said, and if you really get proven wrong, give it up. So those are sort of the list that if you ask a group of students what makes for a good disagreement, they'll come up with that list.
So here's a question, or two questions. One, can you identify a public discussion in American political history which has met your standards, which has not involved demagoguery, in the sense that people come into it with genuinely open minds, inquiring into the good faith positions of one another?
I think that there are lots. I think that we don't necessarily see them when we're going to look at a speech a person has made, because often they're advocating their position. But you can, I would say a lot of Supreme Court deliberations would be in that category where people, clearly change their mind, say that the distinction between Abrams versus U.S. and Schenck versus U.S., there was clearly some deliberation that went on in there.
Well, I mean, one answer is that there are certain institutional contexts that facilitate reasoned dialogue. I think that's absolutely right. I think courts tend in that direction. I think administrative hearings tend in that direction. What would you say about the proposition that electoral politics simply can't adopt that sort of approach?
When there's a culture of demagoguery, it can't. But when that is lower, I think there's a better possibility of it. So I would put some of Lincoln's speeches, actually, interestingly enough, although he was in a culture of demagoguery. What some people do, and this is when I think it's really disturbing, is when you take certain groups of Americans and make them the them, that's going to have a different consequence from even something like Murrow was doing, of saying, yeah, there's a them. The Soviets are a them. And that's less disruptive and destructive. Yeah, you've got to...
Yeah, so just on this point, if Senator Sanders gets in front of a microphone and says, billionaires have rigged the political system in their favor, and we have to grab it back from them, is he engaging in demagoguery?
Not at that moment. I would say, though, his bumper sticker, real people, that's demagoguery. Because
What's the
it's,
difference?
because the billionaires versus other people there are a lot of other people that are
I
possible.
know, but the billionaires are the them you were just talking about.
No, I think the problem with the real people bumper sticker is it's saying anybody who disagrees with Sanders is not a real person. And there are a lot of people who disagree with him, from the left even. So that's the difference. There's a difference between saying polluters are terrible people and they're doing terrible things and we need to stop them, from you're either supporting my position or else you're a polluter.
We're going over, we're gonna move to real time. Go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I was going to give another example of that because.
No, I'm sorry, there will be a cue.
Okay, no, I'm done. I did mine.
Okay.
You
What,
can answer this question, but then you have to.
okay, answer his question and we'll go back to that.
Okay.
I was just going to give another concrete example that I find fascinating. In my neighborhood, a lot of people put up signs since the election reading, "Hate has no home here," in about 5 different languages, only one of which I understand. And I've always found it intriguing because you can read that sign 2 different ways, and depending on your emphasis. And unfortunately, too many people seem to have it as "hate has no home here." I don't know about my neighbors. I'm not touching them. And I find it fascinating that people can create, just by emphasis of the words, an us versus them. I tend to be a fan of a man named Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book about this. We all kind of intrinsically have this us versus them mentality. We're almost hardwired to do it. And so it's, for me, very difficult to see the term demagogues as anything other than simply an invective that you throw at whoever the other is, regardless of whether it's good faith, regardless of all of, I think, very rational, genuine efforts to give an objective definition.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's there.
I wouldn't say, I'm not a big fan of the term objective. I think it conflates ontology and epistemology and cognition and all sorts of stuff. And so I would instead use falsifiable. And what I've tried to do is propose something that I think is falsifiable and is empirically testable to see. So that was part of what I was trying to do with the research, because it is typically demagoguery. People use that to be effective rhetoric on the part of a position I don't like. And that's a useless definition. Mm-hmm. I think your other point, though, I quickly discovered I needed to get off the term hate, because I don't think it's necessary. I think it's fine to hate Nazis. You know, I think people can hate the Kunz guy. You know, that's actually, I think it's rational to hate Nazis. So it's really not about hate, which is also why I sort of, I think if there's really nothing you hate, that's something to consider. That we probably should hate some stuff. So, yeah. I'm sort of dominating this. So what is your answer?
No, Sam, I'm kind of a simple constitutional lawyer. So the question of whether the question in my mind is kind of what sorts of institutions
Mm-hmm.
generate inclinations to cohesive efforts to solve problems,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to authoritarian thuggery. One sort of institution is the simple disabling of the government from preventing people from speaking. I think that is important, both in terms of defining a national ethos and in terms of holding institutions accountable, and in terms of allowing public policy to learn from mistakes. A second sort of institution, I think, is federalism. Right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that allows for the sort of open-ended possibilities in America, and that stands in the way of a national triumph of authoritarian thuggery, is that there are always institutional nexes mm-hmm. that can stand against the efforts to demonize any particular group. Now, of course, the downside is that they also will be able to demonize their local political groups. But on balance, it seems to me federalism is really an important hedge against the ultimate ultimate triumph of authoritarian thuggery.
But we've had authoritarian thuggery in the U.S. Slavery was nothing more than authoritarian thuggery. Segregation was authoritarian thuggery.
Absolutely. And we also had the Pennsylvania standing up to refuse to allow slavery, and ultimately had a dialogue that eliminated slavery. Likewise, we had Massachusetts and Pennsylvania passing statutes that that achieved equal rights and eventually transcended. Not to say that that you won't have evil taking place. I think what you have is a hedge against evil triumphing, or authoritarian thuggery triumphing across the board. There will always be nexties from which dialogue can emerge.
I would say the Fugitive Slave Act is authoritarian thuggery across the board.
And I say that the Fugitive Slave Act was met with local resistance by state governments and organizing at the state level. So yeah.
But that doesn't mean that. I mean, but the federal government instituted authoritarian thuggery.
Oh yeah. No, but in today's environment, right? The fact that Letitia James, right, is the Attorney General of New York, is an important thing.
Yes.
The fact that there is a civil service that is separate and apart from the unified executive is an important thing. And all of that, I think, is a kind of cauldron for the generation of the sort of dialogue that ultimately will move from, or can move from, demagoguery to dialogue.
Well,
Can I make a point? I think you've been waiting for your question.
yeah. Let's do her quote.
I
Okay.
interrupted you, so
Yeah.
if you don't mind,
Okay.
I hope
Sorry.
this is a good one now.
Thanks.
Okay, we have here,
He doesn't know.
what is the difference between demagoguery and populism? Does the latter always include the former?
Aristotle actually dealt with this, and you can have demagoguery of the elite. And in fact, sometimes I think the most toxic demagoguery is elitist demagoguery. So eugenics is an example of elitist demagoguery. So no, it's not. So they're totally different. There's a really, really good book on populism where he calls it populism, but I think I would call it toxic populism. And populism can be part of demagoguery, but isn't necessarily.
Okay. Is the in-group fearful that it would lose a policy argument? Is the in-group materially threatened by the out-group? What is the relationship between rhetorical and material vulnerability?
That's a great question. It's Michael Mann, who's a sociologist who looked at fascism, argues that people go for fascism when they're threatened with losing privilege and prestige, and that they will lose money rather than lose prestige and privilege. And so that's really when people get frightened. And I think that's what threatens. There's pretty good evidence that, well, if you watch certain stations, you can see it, that they emphasize whiteness, conservative Christianity, these things that have been in positions of privilege and sort of normality. That's the whole fear-mongering about people saying happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, is that you're going to lose that prestige of assuming that everybody around you celebrates your holidays. So yeah, I think there is, I don't know if you call prestige a material condition, but it certainly figures pretty heavily into people's tendency to be prone to demagoguery and feel really threatened by an outgroup that is going to not let them hold on to their privileged position.
Got any more?
I think here's one. So Murray reminds us that citizenship involves a certain level of responsibility. Chief among responsibilities are truth discernment, fact-checking, and civic engagement. If a portion of the populace chooses to abdicate those responsibilities, are we surprised that demagoguery results? No, not. But more fundamentally, do Americans have a right to check out, be apathetic, etc.? And should those who do stay informed work within the system for changes? Should they be responsible for their fellow citizens' ignorance? And if they're marching in the street with tiki torches, I'd say yes. If they're trolling on the internet, I'd say no. I don't know. I mean, I kick over rocks, and so it is. I will say it's much harder now to tell whether you're dealing with a bot or a troll rather than an actual human being. And they're getting better at. The bots are getting better, and the trolls are getting better. They're better paid, for one thing. So even I have sort of dialed back on how much I interact with them, but I'm just watching them and watching what their talking points are, and that's really, really interesting for me. But I think I don't know exactly how we deal with the fact that we've got people who are happy just to burn it all down. I don't know what we do about that. I think what I saw before the 2016 election was I watched those trolls and bots effectively create wedge issues between Democrats. And so I think that's what we really want to watch out for is not taking those same baits that they had.
And which leads to the institutional question: what interventions could decrease the bait taking?
And your stuff on transparency is so good, and how vexed it is. And Facebook is trying to be more transparent. You may not know this if you're on Facebook. It's just a little thing. But for all the groups, there are in ads. There's this little transparency thing, and you can click on it, and they'll try to tell you what it is.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily work all that well because people don't click on it.
Right.
So it's particularly with that I'm dubious about institutional solutions. I think the market is a better solution. And I almost never think the market is.
We have one more written, and then we'll take.
I'm sorry. I just want to follow up with it. When you said the market, isn't that almost exactly what Fox News is doing in a way? Because they're saying there's this information out there, whether or not you believe what its slant is, but if it's coming from the Heritage Conservancy or if it's coming from other conservative leading publications, they're looking at the marketplace and they're saying, well, you've got the segment of the American population that's just not going to do the research, so I'm going to do the research and I'm going to filter it towards my view, but I'm going to bring it out to them. But that's my role in the marketplace.
Right, and right now that's a very profitable way to go about it, and I think we need to make it less profitable. And there are a few ways of doing that. I mean, one is that actually what had good impact was going after advertisers and saying advertisers should not be promoting racism. And that did more good than I think laws could on that particular issue. I think also that that may be one place where I really don't know. I don't have any relatives who watch Fox News or listen to Limbaugh. Or even the more concerning things that are out on YouTube. Everybody's talking about Facebook and Fox News and stuff, but YouTube is really where the worrisome stuff is. And I don't know what we do about that. But I have found in arguing with people on the internet, asking them if they're getting their information from sources that would tell you if it wasn't true can be really helpful. Of just saying, okay, you have this really strong belief in this candidate being the best. Are you getting your information from anyone who would tell you if they weren't? And the answer is no. And then you're like, well, then you don't really know what you mean. You don't know. But that's almost a sort of one-on-one.
On that note, 7:30.
So let us thank our discussants, Professor Patricia Roberts-Miller and Professor Seth Kreimer. Thank you for coming. Good night and good luck.